It was the 20th. Across the sea, from horizon to horizon, a slow and mighty force was moving towards England. The great crusade against England had arrived. 124 great ships, on which all swearing and blasphemy was outlawed. Under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, they were coming to bring the Duke of Parma's army from the Netherlands, and the heretic Isle of England was to be brought to heel. The story of England's defense against the Armada has been buried under centuries of myth. The island of the Virgin Queen was defended by invincible heroes. Take my drum to England, hang it by the shore, strike it when your powder's running low. If the Dons strike Devon, I'll quit the port of heaven, and we'll drum them up that channel as we drummed them long ago. Drake's drum will sound to summon him back from the dead in the hour of national peril. Like King Arthur, Drake lies buried deep in the underworld of English mythology. When he was away on his great odyssey around the world, his wife gave him up for dead. She called herself a widow and agreed to marry again. But Drake, half a world away, looked in his magic mirror and saw everything. He fired a mighty cannon on his ship. As the ceremony was about to start, the cannonball flew across the seas to drop at his wife's feet. Drake, he was a Devon man and ruled the Devon seas, and there were men from other counties who were part of the great battle against the Armada. Men like Martin Frobisher, Nottingham adventurer, painted at the peak of his fame in the pose of buccaneering aggression we now associate with the Wild West. But Drake's is the name that rings down the ages, even though Drake was only second in command of the fleet, under Howard of Effingham. And after the first encounter with the Spaniards, Howard's account of the battle never mentions Drake again. The way the English fought the Armada is a mystery. These drawings, based on a design for the English admiral, show how the crescent formation of the Armada sailed along the coast followed by the English until it reached Calais. It made no attempt to land. There was hardly any fighting, and it arrived at Calais without the English sinking a single Spanish ship. And yet, by the time the Armada reached Calais, it had lost. The best document we have to understand what was happening is the sea itself. and the men to read it are not historians but seamen. The tides and currents around the English coast are as complex as any in the world, and what emerges when men who know the sea consider that week in 1588 is a contest as subtle and delicate as a game of chess.
Very good. Have to come round on plan.
As we leave Plymouth Harbour on board the anti-submarine frigate HMS Argonaut, there seems to be very little in common between the grey steel warship of the modern Navy and the wooden hulls of Queen Elizabeth I's Navy. But on the 19th of July, 1588, Howard and Drake were here with a force of some 90 ships. News arrived on that day, the 19th of July, that the Spanish Armada were in the offing. It was essential to get out of this harbour, because to be trapped in here by the Spanish forces at close quarters would have spelt disaster.
There's time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too. Drake's celebrated game of bowls is part of the legend of England's great Armada era. But if he was playing bowls, Drake must have been in a tavern. Devon Bull is a kind of pub skittles, and he was not supposed to be here. The English fleet had been trapped in Plymouth by the wind. They were supposed to be blockading Spain, and the wind that had forced them back into this harbour was the wind the Spanish were riding. The English must have been very worried. The Bowles story, though, does make some sense, because there was no point in trying to rush to sea.
From 3 until 9 in the evening, the tide was flooding, so no move could be made until after dark and into the teeth of the wind. So to get the initial movement, the vessels had to be warped out using tow ropes and small boats to give them the sea room so that they were not pushed straight back onto the shore. And then they would have to tack and work their way into the wind to clear the harbour. In fact, some 20 of the force of 90 ships did not get out.
Armada relics are as misleading as the stories. This navigational toy is called Drake's Dial, although there's no evidence that it was his. But, like the Bowles, a fairy tale conceals a truth.
This astronomical compendium may or may not have belonged to Sir Francis, but this chart of the Atlantic coasts of Europe, and particularly of Spain, certainly did belong to him. It's part of a set of tide tables, which, in the flyleaf, bear his name.
Drake was a daring navigator, the first Englishman to circle the world. But his real significance has been purged from the fairy tale. He was a social revolutionary.
I believe that the voyage of circumnavigation had an effect which, in 1588, would be of enormous consequence to England's defense against the Spanish Armada. Up till then, ships had been commanded by a combination of noblemen, of military officers, and, perhaps least of all, seamen. Drake found that this was no good to him, and he fell out with the gentlemen adventurers, and indeed hanged one of them. Afterwards, he drew up a new social compact within his ships. The gentlemen, he said, must haul and draw with the mariners, and the mariners must haul and draw with the gentlemen. There were no longer to be social distinctions of rank aboard English ships. The captain, predominantly a seaman, was the man who would be in sole command, and everyone else would work under and cooperate with him. This was not a social compact which the Spaniards adopted.
Medina Sidonia was the very model of aristocratical propriety and commanded the kind of instant obedience which goes with unimpeachable social cachet. But he couldn't run the Armada the way Lord Howard ran the English fleet.
The Armada was drawn from many nations, with a strict hierarchy of command. Sailors ranked below soldiers, and over them were the aristocrats and the agents of King Philip himself.
It was almost as if a province of the Spanish Empire had been cut loose and set afloat. So you could say that this was a floating empire ruled by a viceroy.
In England, small coastal towns like Sandwich were traditionally supposed to supply ships to defend the narrow seas. Sandwich is one of the Cinque Ports, which had organized that defense for centuries. It still raises the money to be used for fighting ships in times of national emergency.
Now ask you to kindly pay your ship money.
1 shilling, 2 shillings, 3 shillings, 4 shillings, 5 shillings, 6 shillings, 7 shillings, 8 shillings, 9 shillings.
10 shillings, 50 pence, won't buy a battleship now, and it didn't pay for a galleon in 1588. The Cinque Ports were too poor to do their job. Most of the ships that sailed out to fight the Spanish went not because they were commanded to go, but because they wanted to go. They were hoping to make money out of it.
Many of the ships which sailed against the Armada came from coastal trading ports, particularly from London. This is Leon Sea, at the mouth of the Thames estuary, and 5 Lee ships were fitted out by the City of London to support the Queen's Navy. They were, if you like, a kind of volunteer reserve. Their masters and crews were local sailors and fishermen who were used to working together, and this sense of comradely teamwork pervaded the English fleet.
This rabble of merchant ships joined in mainly in the hope of capturing a rich Spanish galleon.
But the Lee ships were small. The largest of them, the Salamander, was only 180 tons, and they appear to have played little effective part in the battles.
The effective ships were the small group financed directly by the Crown. This is one of them, the Ark Royal. The Crescent fleet of the Armada would not arrive at Plymouth before daybreak. The English had to escape before it trapped them in the harbour.
From the operations room of HMS Argonaut, we consider the next stage in those events of 400 years ago. The 2 English squadrons have cleared the Sound. On the night of the 19th, the morning of the 20th of July, Lord Howard, the Lord High Admiral, with 54 ships, has headed out to seaward to take advantage of tidal streams and currents, probably give him an extra 3 or 4 knots to move behind the Spanish Armada. Drake, with his 13 ships, his 13 adventurers, well-armed and very nimble fighting ships, keeping fairly close inshore. They're having to work hard. It's hard work tacking, and also it's a high degree of seamanship. And the idea being that the 2 forces will then come behind the crescent shape of the Armada and be in a position to attack that soft underbelly.
Most people in England, and the commanders of the fleet, believed the Armada was going to try to land somewhere on the south coast. Alarum for London was a play designed to strike terror into the hearts of waiting Englishmen. It dramatized rape, robbery and child killing by ruthless Spanish soldiers.
Captain bastard! Look me in the face. Have you the heart to kill a pretty girl?
Oh, the young brats cling about our those dash out their brains!
Where are my children? Mary! Letty, I heard you cry. Oh, speak, pretty souls, where are you?
Husband, Harmon, whither do you go? Alas, you fall into the enemy's hands for lack of sight.
My children, wife, my children, where are they?
It was originally called The Spoil of Antwerp, but was retitled to suit the occasion. And now it forms part of Tilbury's commemoration of the Armada.
Think you with whining to preserve your wealth?
Philip had been king in England before Elizabeth came to the throne. His wife Mary had been a relentless persecutor of Protestants. Now that Philip meant to take England back, that was not to be forgotten. The struggle was cast in terms of religious propaganda. After all, Elizabeth was head of a Protestant state. Fox's Book of Martyrs, describing the torture and death of English Protestants, was a bestseller. Great Catholic houses had been found to shelter Jesuit priests, working in secret for Elizabeth's downfall. This house, Stoner in Oxfordshire, has a secret room in the roof where Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest, set up a Catholic printing press. He was captured, tortured, and executed. Elizabeth had Catholic missionaries done to death because she saw them as the core of sedition. The execution of Jesuits was an important part of her policy. As the Armada prepared, she had hundreds of Catholics imprisoned. But would her navy withstand a full-scale military attack?
Although the forces facing each other sound a little imbalanced, there are 124 Spanish ships and there are only 90 English ships at this stage, in major fighting units they were about balanced, because there would been about 60 of what might be termed real fighting ships involved with each side. The Spanish ships' main fighting units was the galleon, and the galleon had evolved for the trading routes to the Indies, capable of carrying the more precious cargoes of gold and silver, yet extremely well armed to ward off pirates. The English prime fighting unit was carried one stage further, really. It was known as a race-built galleon and was capable of sailing much closer to the wind, a better underwater shape, etc., providing the English with a very handy, nimble fighting machine.
It used to be thought that English fighting ships had remained much like Spanish ones until just before the Armada. This drawing of the Mary Rose, a warship which sank in 1545, shows just such a cumbersome vessel. But that ship has been recovered from the sea.
There is the first sight of this flagship of Henry VIII. It's the first time we have seen this in 437 years. What an amazing sight.
The archaeologist in charge, Margaret Rule, is now convinced that the revolution in English shipbuilding was already well advanced.
When we look at the ship that we recovered from the sea in 1982, we see that although she's very full amidships and very flat, she's very, very fine indeed at the bow and at the stern, and she certainly cut the water at the bow and spilled the water at the stern most efficiently. So when we look at the ship overall, we see a well-integrated weapons system with the ship herself functioning as the stock of the gun, bringing first of all the long-range weapons into bear on the enemy, and then as the ship progresses forward, the shorter-range weapons. It would seem that here in England we were 2 generations ahead of the type of ship being used in the Spanish Armada in 1588.
This gave a complete difference in the approach of the two sides. The Spanish had a tight military formation and they carried many soldiers. This was going to be of advantage in close quarter action, which is what they aimed for, whereas the English ships, being nimble and handy, could take advantage of that particular aspect and use their long-range guns. Artillery at a distance would be the answer.
Which was why the English were keeping the Spanish downwind of them.
The wind was behind the Spanish galleons, as was the English, of course. The problem for the Spanish was how they could sail up to meet the English. Unlike a modern sailing yacht, which has got a fore and aft rig, triangular you might say, Spanish galleons, of course, had a square sail rig. We're here today on board the training ship Royalist, and we've altered the rig slightly to more or less like a galleon, to try a little bit of an experiment just to find out how difficult it was to try and sail to windward.
The wind is blowing from the camera position. Royalist has to try to sail towards us. Since it cannot sail into the wind, it must try to tack, to zigzag towards the wind. This involves complex adjustments to the sails. The critical moment comes here, as the ship swings directly into the wind. At this point, the ship is out of control and anything can happen. She may go through to the other tack, or she may just slowly drift back where she came from. Which is exactly what happened on this attempt. In fact, the Spanish probably took sails up and down to help them tack. This could take up to half an hour.
Here we are with modern technology, we can't do it.
We can do it. I mean, the wind was 70 degrees round then, wasn't it? On the bow, relative wind.
What chance has Spanish Armada got?
Zilch.
As the Spanish warships struggled to turn and protect the lumbering transport vessels in that soft underbelly, they suffered one disaster. The Rosario's foremast broke when it collided with two other Spanish ships. It began to drift helplessly. And rather than break formation, Medina Sidonia and his armada sailed away from it. That night, Drake showed his true colors. Appointed to watch the Spanish all night and show a lantern for others to follow, he put out his light and sneaked off to collect the Rosario as his personal prize. As dawn broke, with no light to follow, the English fleet was scattered. The admiral found himself almost alone with the enemy fleet, and the Rosario was completely alone with Francis Drake. Drake's great country house had been bought with the plunder of Spanish ships around the world. His trade was finding and capturing richly laden vessels, and he was master of his craft. Pedro de Valdez, the commander of the Rosario, knew he had been abandoned. He surrendered without a fight. He saw no shame, he said, in surrendering to Francis Drake. He handed over his ship and the pay chest full of gold. Martin Frobisher was enraged that Drake had the prize to himself. He thinketh to cozen us of our share of 15,000 ducats, but I will make him spend the best blood in his belly. The first skirmish had shown that the Armada's formation was impregnable. Since no English ship could expect to get close without being overwhelmed, there seemed to be nothing to prevent them landing. The Armada's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was pleasantly relieved that the English fleet had proved so timid. If they had wanted to fight, they could have done so today. He might even have stopped to fight them and rescue the Rosario, but he was under direct orders not to seek a battle.
En cuanto al rey le prohíbe entrar en batalla, a ser posible no tiene que pelear. La batalla de Inglaterra la tiene que hacer Parma. Él lo único que tiene es que ayudar a Parma a que pase. Y luego entregarle las 6.000 soldados de la Armada.
The Duke of Parma was in charge of the army that had been suppressing revolt in the Low Countries. And where the massacres of previous commanders had failed, Parma's more subtle methods had achieved a good measure of success. He widened and deepened drainage canals to give his forces mobility by water, safe from the Dutch fighting ships. This was how he was able to concentrate forces for his greatest success, the capture of Antwerp. He blockaded the city by closing the river above it. He built a bridge of boats across the Scheldt between two forts. In desperation, the Dutch had tried to break the blockade by devising a new weapon, the Hellburner. They killed 600 men in a single explosion, the most devastating weapon ever used. Burning ships crammed with timed explosives had been floated down the river, but they had not stopped Parma from taking Antwerp, and now his troops were waiting to invade England. But there was one problem, the postal system.
One of the problems that had dogged the Armada from the start was the difficulty of getting messages from Flanders to the fleet. It was hard, and Parma has often been accused of neglecting his basic duty to keep in touch with the other Supreme Commander. But this is unjust. He tried. He tried several times. Captain Morosine, for example, is sent from Dunkirk in a ship with a message to the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Unfortunately, that ship hits a sandbank, and Morosine has to swim back to port. He tries again a few weeks later. This time he runs into the English fleet off Brittany and has to seek refuge while the seas again become safe. By the time he reaches Corunna, the Armada has already left. But the letter he had contained the devastating news that Medina Sidonia was acting under the wrong impression. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was convinced that when he arrived off Dunkirk, the fleet of the Duke of Parma would come out and join him. Morosine's letter said this was quite impossible.
The problem was that the coast of Flanders is one long sandbank. It's shallow enough for shrimp fishermen to work on horseback. In fact, in 1588 they had to work on horseback because Parma had taken all the boats for his invasion of England. The invasion army would cross the shallows in small fishing boats and barges and sail on to England escorted by the Armada. Parma's small boats were only capable of making the crossing in a perfect calm, and these small boats could only get out to the Armada if they were unopposed.
I think most people are a bit likely to forget that the Dutch fleet near Dunkirk and Newport, the blockade fleet, made it impossible for Parma to get out of the harbour.
Certainly Philip seems to have forgotten the Dutch fleet. And to make matters worse, the Armada itself could not help. Parma did not hold a deep water port for the Armada to enter. It would have to stand out to sea and wait for him.
It was impossible for Parma to get out of Dunkirk and Newport without help of the Armada ships. And the Armada ships couldn't help because the waters were too shallow for these big Spanish vessels.
To get away from these beaches successfully, Parma's army would have to make a dash out of the canals at the very moment the Armada arrived. But he would need several days' notice to embark the troops. In the meantime, he carried out practice embarkations.
The 18th of July of 1588, the Duke of Parma wrote to the king. People of all nations, on foot and horseback, are in their places, and so near to the quaysides as other times I have reported to your Majesty. About 6,000 Spaniards, 8,000 Germans, 7,000 Walloons, 3,000 Italians, 1,000 Irishmen, under the command of Sir William Stanley, and 16 cavalry companies. So about 35,000 men were ready for the enterprise.
Obviously, these men could not be kept permanently in their invasion barges. With 70 men in a barge, they had standing room only. The troops were dispersed again as soon as he'd written that letter. And to keep the Dutch Navy from knowing his plans, this practice was not carried out at the correct location. Parma was certain that his only chance of successfully getting past the Dutch frigates was to make a surprise dash out of the canals. He would use the canals to bring his men together again at the last possible moment, but that would take several days. Meanwhile, he waited for news of the advancing fleet. None came. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was sending a stream of letters to Parma saying he was on his way, but the letters travelled no faster than the fleet. Naturally, Parma had no news. Naturally, Medina Sidonia had no reply from Parma. And naturally, the commander of the Armada began to get very worried. His fleet was sailing along the south coast towards Portland Bill, and he didn't even know if the army was ready to be collected. He decided that he should not go too far without knowing that.
This letter contains a secret. It's the coded postscript to the Duke of Medina Sidonia's communication to the king, concluded at dawn just as the fleet enters the English Channel. There's still no news from Parma. The Duke has been looking at his maps. He can see clearly enough that there are very few anchorages close to the coast of Flanders. And in this letter he says to the king, if when I get to the Isle of Wight, I have not heard from Parma, I shall have to seek refuge there because it is the last anchorage I will find until I get to the narrow seas where there is no port deep enough to take my ships.
Portland Coast Guard, this is Washington Bendis, Naval.
Analysing the events of 1588 with the help of the Coast Guards, we can see how the struggle came to centre on the Solent, the safe anchorage between the Isle of Wight and the mainland, where the Armada could wait to establish communications with Parma. The Armada was travelling eastward along the coast at speeds dictated by the wind and tide. On board the English fleet, you can be sure, pilots and navigators were plotting the Armada's course and seeing where it was bound. We asked the Coast Guards to repeat those calculations, revealing the Armada's intended course. They were able to use a search and rescue computer system which predicts the course of drifting vessels.
First of all, I'm taking that if the Armada left Portland Bill around about dawn on the 2nd, without any hindrance by the English forces, I'm running up to see where the what time the Armada would be off the eastern end of the Solent. Having fed all the tidal figures into our search planning computer, and we've worked out the tidal effect on the Armada, we then went and plotted that on charts. But so that we can have a pictorial illustration of what actually happens, this animated video has been produced to show the effects of the tide on the black dot that depicts the Armada. What we find from our plottings are that the Armada would have carried favourable tides and would have arrived at the eastern side of the Solent, the eastern entrance to the Solent, with a favourable tide, and would have been able to achieve a safe haven in the eastern part of the Solent.
This is the first time this exercise has ever been carried out. And it shows that unless the English could prevent it, the Armada would be able to go into the Solent on the tide. The Armada needed the help of the tides. It was a military convoy moving at the pace of the slowest ship. That was a slow walking pace, no faster than a rowing boat. The Royalist is moving at the same speed. And here it is trying to enter the Solent against the tide. It's rather like walking up the down escalator. In fact, Royalist is moving through the water, but the water runs out of the Solent fast enough for it to be moving backwards. The English could not have known of the Armada's secret message to Philip, but if the Armada meant to land, the Solent was an obvious target. But it hadn't got there yet. And perhaps one statement made by the English admiral shows that he intended to prevent it ever getting there. We mean to so course the enemy as that they shall have no leisure to land. The English made their first move at Portland Bill. Most summer mornings there's an onshore breeze, and Martin Frobisher placed himself downwind of the Armada. He looked like an easy target.